What kind of people are we?
I am in radio contact.
What kind of people are we?
Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. And surprise, we're going to get right into it today, because I've got a great interview with a new guest. I will say quick that, as always, you're invited to join us on Twitter at EISTPOD, or on Facebook in our Facebook discussion group, Enterprising Interlocutions. Also, you can join us on the Just Enough Trope Discord and talk with us about Star Trek, films, TV shows, comic books, video games, everything the nerd inside of you won't shut up about. Join us on Discord. I'll leave a link to join that Discord in the show notes. We'll see you there. And please consider joining our crew by visiting our Patreon at patreon.com/EISTpod. We spent a lot of time this season interrogating the utopia that Trek presents and asking how all the individual parts of it work. Something I've always wondered about is how education has changed in the Federation's egalitarian, scarcity-free society. When you think about it, nearly every character that we follow on every Trek series are all alums of the same school, Starfleet Academy. They all need specific and varied training to perform their duties, and yet Keiko's one-room school on DS9 is about as deep as we go into education in the Star Trek universe. It should be really important, assuming they're not just beaming smarts into their heads or using knowledge tapes or something sci-fi like that. What does a 24th century classroom look like? How has the utopia of the Federation changed learning in the future? Tell me they're at least taking cool field trips in the holodeck. We touched on this subject briefly when I talked with Dr. Mohammed Noor earlier this year, but I wanted to go deeper into the subject with somebody who is on the front lines of education today, and that's why Kelli Fitzpatrick is on the show. In addition to being a writer and a community activist, Kelli also teaches high school English, as well as classes on the process of writing for aspiring young authors. During the interview, Kelli and I talk about how Trek depicts learning, the teaching tools of the future, the way that education breaks down our societal barriers. It's a fascinating topic, and Kelli was a great guest, so I hope you enjoy the show. We'll be back next week and for the rest of October with some spooky Star Trek content, so join us then. For now, grab your stack of pads and get ready to study your 3 R's, Riker, Romulans, and Ractagino. And with that, let's get underway. My guest on the show today is Kelli Fitzpatrick. Kelli is an author, a teacher, and a community activist who was a winner of the 2016 Strange New Worlds competition. She also writes flash fiction, and her essays on genre entertainment have been featured in various anthologies and on womenatwarp.com. Kelli, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. I always ask new guests on the show how they first became Star Trek fans. When did you first discover Star Trek?
I discovered Star Trek watching it with my parents, especially my dad. He's a huge Trekkie. And Voyager was my first Trek. That was the one that kind of set the bar for me for what Star Trek was. And I just adored Captain Janeway and really the whole crew and the whole story of them, trying to get home and all their interactions with the other species. And then kind of discovered the other series as I went.
When you were watching Voyager, did you have a perception of it being a part of the legacy of, a larger franchise? Or was it just, it's this Voyager show that I really like, and wait a minute, there's more?
Yeah, I was pretty young.
Okay.
So I want to say like early middle school or something. And I had no idea. I had seen things that said Star Trek on them, and my dad had a lot of Star Trek novels. So I kind of knew who like Spock and Kirk were, but I never saw an original series episode until I think I was in college.
Okay.
So really it was just, Voyager at first. And then I remember watching Deep Space Nine. And I remember Geordi from Next Gen the most because I was a fan of reading Rainbow when I was a kid, and so I was like, it's LeVar Burton. I know that person,
Yeah.
So, but it was very much a family affair, and so yeah.
Yeah, he does. He does make an appearance, I think, in that one episode of Voyager, and then of course Barclay becomes a part of the storyline as the thing goes on. But yeah, as you get farther out from TOS and TNG, those kind of in references that they like to put get sort of fewer on the ground. Like I'm trying to think about Enterprise, except for the infamous ending. I mean, there's no real way to connect, the earlier show's characters into what's going on in Enterprise.
They like drop little hints, like in the opening episode of Enterprise, they say something like, "Since when do we have Vulcan science officers?"
Right.
But you really have to be like a true kind of fan, I think, to pick those up. Because I remember watching Enterprise the first time through. I really enjoyed the series, but I did not get all of those references until rewatches. So.
Or they've got James Cromwell like in the first episode or whatever, and it's like, this guy seems important somehow. Was he in some other thing?
Yep.
You're a high school English teacher, and English students, of course, are assigned to read lots of plays and novels and short stories for class. Have you ever used any Star Trek literature or media in your curriculum?
So, not directly as part of the curriculum. I have pulled it up a few times as like in little clips as examples of different, literary devices or whatever we happen to be talking about in the curriculum. Yeah. I also advise a creative writing group that meets after school once a week, and we do quite a bit of discussion of Star Trek in there because I usually have a couple of kids who, are all over that. But the kids know, like they know that I have written Star Trek. They know that I'm a Trekkie. I have posters in my room, that have space and Hubble photos and Star Trek stuff all over it. And so it comes up in conversation because I think it's important for kids to see us being passionate about the things that we love and talking about that to them. So it's a great way to connect to the kids.
Yeah. Can you talk about the genesis of that, the idea for the after school writing group?
So I want to say it was like my second year of teaching. I'm going into my 8th year. So this was about 5, 6 years ago. Okay. And NaNoWriMo is National Novel Writing Month in November. And I was messing around writing, short stories and flash fiction and stuff at the time. And I decided, it would be really cool to just give this a shot, this whole 50,000 words in a month, whatever. And I had a lot of really dedicated students at the time that really enjoyed creative writing. And so I had this crazy idea. I'm going to go into school tomorrow and I'm going to pitch and say, are there any students who would like to do this with me? And we'll just meet a couple times a week at lunch in my room and we'll, encourage each other and talk about what we're writing. Sure. And I had 12 kids sign up off the bat. And I think by the end of the month, I had 20-ish. Wow. And then we got to the end of the month. Of course, none of us hit 50,000 words, but it became a community and a safe place for kids to come and not just hang out, but to really delve into their creative sides and get to really have choice and agency over what they were writing. Yeah. And so they were like, please, Miss Fitz, don't cancel this. We want it to keep going. Okay. And so here we are 5 years later and it's still going. Although we did move to the local community center. It's called the Beaverton Activity Center. Okay. And they have some really nice rooms. And so we meet over there instead of in my classroom.
Oh, that's amazing. The importance of young people learning to express themselves with the written word seems like a no-brainer. But if we're all going to be communicating by cyber chat, in a few years, how does that importance continue into our digital new century?
So we talk a lot about this in my classroom. I teach 11th and 12th grade English, and we talk a lot about different registers. So you have academic register, which is the type of language and communication that's appropriate in an academic setting. And then you have casual register, which is appropriate when you're texting someone, LOL what, okay, yeah. And that's fine in that setting. We also talk about ways to communicate effectively in different media. So part of our state standards here in Michigan are for kids to learn digital literacy. And so we do a media literacy project with my seniors where they get to learn how to assess and analyze different forms of media online for information, for the veracity of what's there, and then they get to create some things digitally also. So we're attempting to, reach in that relevant direction to prepare kids for college, career, but also just being human beings in the 21st century.
Yeah, right. That's something that I would have to imagine. We don't see it on screen in Trek, but would be a big part of Trek education in like the 23rd and 24th century. You think about the possibly apocryphal anecdotes now about like young children trying to swipe like dead tree books, because they're just so used to growing up with electronic media, and having like holograms and holodecks and subspace communication. Like in the future, they would have to be very savvy in different forms or facilities of that media communication.
Yes, and I actually find it interesting because most of the times that we actually see a classroom in Trek, which is not all that often, it looks more like a traditional classroom, just with maybe some upgraded equipment. And so, on Deep Space Nine, we've got Professor Keiko in her room. She's got a really fancy, touchscreen at the front of the room, but kids are sitting in desks in rows facing forward. She's direct instructing, asking, questions, and kids are raising their hand and answering. And so I find it interesting that the creators of Star Trek kind of kept certain aspects of the quote unquote traditional forms of education in the way that they portrayed it. But then also we get these other, really cool pictorial sort of learning. I'm thinking of like Spock in the JJ verse, the little Spock when he's like,
when they're in the little bubbles or
whatever. The little
Yeah.
learning bubbles, and he's like answering all these questions at one time, and then I think the holodeck is like such a underutilized learning tool. Like, why would you teach anywhere except the holodeck? Like, I want kids to like read something and then, okay, now you're gonna like go
now
play
you're gonna be in Jane Eyre.
Yes, you're gonna go play this holo novel or write your own holo novel.
Right.
So
yeah.
It's interesting that we have that blending of the old and the new.
Yeah. We met at the Shore Leave Convention this year, and you were on some panels about writing and education. You were also on a panel about Star Trek Adventures, the Modiphius role-playing game, which you're writing for. Can you talk about how you got involved with Modiphius?
So I met Jim Johnson, I believe. We met online through some common Trek writer friends, and just got talking about this project that he's editing, the Star Trek Adventures line. And I was just really impressed with the way that this game is set up and how much it's really made to make you feel like you're in the Star Trek universe,
right?
And you get to play your own episodes essentially,
right.
And be the characters and make the choices, and then game masters can obviously create their own adventures within that setting. So I just thought it was a really cool way for fans to get to interact with the Star Trek property in a new, interesting way.
So when you're writing something that's a role-playing game like Scenario, what's the difference in constructing the story, trying to leave it open-ended, for player choice? How is it different than writing flash fiction or a short story?
So the biggest difference for me coming at this as a fiction writer is there is no protagonist in a game, because the players are the protagonists, and they have to be able to create themselves. You have no idea who these characters are. You have no idea what their internal conflicts are going to be, anything like that. You've got to leave those open as spaces that really anybody could plug into and still get something out of this interactive game experience.
Right.
So it kind of drops out. We talk as fiction writers that you've got character, you've got setting, and you've got plot are kind of like the three. There's a lot of other moving pieces in fiction, but those are like the three that you kind of have to get down to really understand the story that you're writing. And like one of those is non-existent in the game writing experience. And so that has been interesting for me to have to approach it more from the direction of how can I create a scenario that will be fascinating and challenging and interesting to any sort of Starfleet characters who approach this.
That's so interesting. That's so enlightening for me as well, because I am a gamer and I've spent a lot of my young life and even somewhat older life like writing these scenarios and campaigns and things like that for other players. But when I sit down to write fiction, I find it difficult to sort of create or envision that idea of the central protagonist. And I think you've helped me realize that I've been building these scenarios for many players to be open-ended. And I don't think about it as like, well, what is this character that people are going to follow? Also, I think just like I have an acting background as well. So I think of myself as like being the character if I'm going to, create a scenario, or just what the other characters are thinking and how they sort of interact with that person. So maybe that's my roadblock. I gotta get over that. I gotta find some Holden Caulfield that I can take through this scenario.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting way of explaining it.
Well, you're doing your job already. Even with me. I appreciate that. Well, thanks so much for being on the show with me today. Like a lot of people, I'm really fascinated by this utopic future that's presented in Star Trek. And as we discussed just previously, it's a future that was created by writers who were not social scientists or futurists. And I think they proceeded in constructing it from the understandable but simplistic ideas of nuclear war and racism bad, and they kind of went from there. But for humanity to claw its way out of the rubble of World War III and into a golden age, it's going to need education and it's going to need teachers. And for a show that's literally about characters who went to an academy to become scientific explorers, there's a glaring lack of teaching or educators we see on screen. You mentioned Keiko O'Brien before. Her school disappears essentially from DS9 after a couple seasons. We see Hoshi teaching xenolinguistics in the pilot of Enterprise. And outside of that, I was trying to brainstorm and think of other scenes or characters related to education, and I couldn't come up with much.
I did the same, and there are precious few. Though you really named the ones that really get any sort of fronted screen time on that. There's a lot of discussion, I think, especially around Captain Picard, about sort of this idea of being free to educate yourself as an enlightened, being in the galaxy. But we don't get to see a lot of the actual teachers and educators who very clearly do exist, not just within Starfleet, but within the civilian populace. I would love to see what a school on Earth looks like, in the 24th century for non-Starfleet folks. And obviously they've got limited amount of time, but I'm biased here clearly, but I think that education is so important for a society to advance without imploding, because as we get more and more options that we create for ourselves, we also open potential problems. And I cannot wait until we master the scarcity, problem, and until we've eradicated war and such. But I don't think we're going to get over that hump without very direct, intentional instruction that involves ethics, that involves how to have a peaceful dialogue with difference, with others, and that is foundationally built on rights we call them human rights. Star Trek would maybe call them sentient being rights, but the idea of personhood and the idea that that you have a right as a being to exist and to not have to suffer. And that's not a universally accepted principle, even, in our society today.
It would presumably be in the future of Star Trek, and of course those would all be ongoing, if not totally assimilated and accepted concerns in classrooms that would not only be multiracial, but be, multi-species, multi-alien.
Right.
I mean, they'd have to get over that. I just realized that Hoshi taught at Amazon University,
yes,
which meant something a lot different in 2001.
Yes.
I'm not the troubling implications of that. I don't really like that idea.
Right. It sounds very commercial today, but she literally was just in the Amazon rainforest. And her classroom actually is one of it has no technology that I saw in that episode. She's teaching from like a pad of paper, and they're just like sitting outside on these little benches. And that's its own kind of utopia, in a way, to be able to maybe step away from all of the technology for a while.
Yeah. Harry Kim's mom was a teacher, I think. Spock's mom was a teacher, but probably not in Vulcan because they had those bubbles. Yeah. And Spock becomes an instructor at the Academy, I guess, in the movies. And in fact, I was thinking about it, like the Kobayashi Maru may be the most explicit scene we get in a learning setting, like the actual lesson that we see. And that's troubling because the lesson is you'll always fail at some point, or the crazy psychological horror of your Academy evaluations. People springing a fake disaster on you when you're just walking around, if you're a Starfleet Academy applicant.
That is troubling to me as an educator, and I would feel, what it reminds
Pop quiz.
Me of? It reminds me of, in Michigan, we have the SAT as the state accepted, mandated, like graduation requirement standardized test. Yeah. And we have to spend a significant amount of time prepping kids for this test that they take in 11th grade. And I do my best to prep them for it, but it's still a test that in some ways is kind of designed for them to fail, because it's a sorting test and it's a norm reference test to some degree that is trying to rank kids. And so it's hard to send these kids into this test knowing that many of them are going to be disappointed and take it personally. And so I can only imagine how the professors at the Academy are like, okay, take your Kobayashi Maru, good luck.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And they have to just be tight-lipped about the fact that you're going to crash and burn because you have to.
Yeah, this kid only saved 3 people from a pipe explosion. I don't know if we can take him this year. Yeah, it's just... It's strange. Our characters on the shows, they're boldly going or going boldly if you're a grammar teacher. So maybe the drama of the classroom isn't quite germane to space adventure, but on every show they're using scientific and social and military disciplines that were all learned in a classroom. And instead, they're still being learned by cadets and junior officers during the process of the show. And I'd argue it's a side of the show that we could stand to see more of. They do keep pitching, it seems, like a Starfleet Academy show, but that never seems to come to fruition.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like an aversion to seeing like a lot of very young characters, So it's funny because I teach teenagers, right, every day. Sure. And but I don't read a lot of YA fiction because then you're inside of a teenager's head for like the whole book. And
right.
So it's like, I love my teenage students, but I can only take so much, of kind of that teenage experience in one sitting. But I get the impression that like Starfleet Academy, at least from the episodes that we kind of got to see with like Wesley and Tom Paris, whatever his not Tom Paris, but pre-Tom Paris character who showed up in that episode.
Yeah, Nick Locarno.
Yeah. So I get the impression that it's an experience where they're building character, and it's kind of supposed to be a grown-up space. So yeah. I think it could work. I think they could do it in a way that would maybe we'd get to see Starfleet officers really kind of struggling. I really enjoy the episode where they kind of screw up and they have to face that, because as a teacher, I can tell you, even the best students sometimes make bad decisions, and there's fallout from that. Yeah. But it's also a learning opportunity for everybody involved, and so I would watch that as a teacher. I don't know if anybody else would, but
hopefully they wouldn't all be the DS9 episode where all the kids are on the training cruise, right, and they're on the Defiant class ship, and everything goes horribly wrong.
Oh gosh, yes.
I wanted to get your opinion on something specific that's sort of a side thing. It's about the character of Jake, and more specifically his development as a writer and an artist. We see him become interested in writing, and of course by the time he turns into Tony Todd, he's a famous writer. As somebody who's involved in mentoring kids in the practice of writing, what do you think of DS9's portrayal of Jake as an artist?
I thought it was pretty authentic. Yeah. I always applauded Captain Sisko for the way that he supported Jake in that. It maybe wasn't the first direction that he would have pictured for his son, but he saw how passionate his son was about it, and that he had this desire to really be good at it. And so the other thing that's important in Jake's arc is that he decides to take some risks, and he decides to, go into the hard places to get the story and to get the inspiration. And that's something that sometimes students don't understand, is that there will have to be like sacrifices. If you really want to, do this thing, you really want to be an author, you really want to do really whatever, you're going to have to work really hard. You might have to give some stuff up, but it's really cool to see the adults in his life be supportive.
I bring it up because I tend to hate stories about writing. I feel like, I don't know if it's the preciousness of somebody who is a writer, writing about something that they had to go through. I was talking to Jim Johnson actually about this on my show previously, and talking about how it's like they always frame it as, oh, I've got to get that inspiration, and then when I lose the inspiration, then I'm all frustrated and I'm just sitting at my desk and I've got to get it. And so much of writing is just putting words on paper, whether or not you necessarily are inspired or know where they're going. It's about just like hammering it out and maybe getting inspiration in an edit or, redirecting what you've already done. And TV is always just like, I got to find that thing. Maybe it's going to be Meg Foster massaging my head that's what's going to help me write this thing.
That scene was weird. But that idea of like the muse, right? Kind of like connects to you is, we talk a lot in like writing instruction about craft. So writing is a craft, meaning that it takes a lot of practice. There are specific skills and tools that you can use and you can master and then use in various ways to kind of create your own voice and cultivate the sort of product that you're trying to create in words. Inspiration is a thing, and it happens to all writers, but you won't have a consistent writing practice if you only rely on inspiration. So you have to kind of meet it halfway, I guess I say. And if you're engaging in the things that you're passionate about, that you want to write about, you're going to have things to say. I always tell kids that when they're like, I don't have anything to write about, and I start asking them about, well, what are you passionate about? What do you care about? And they can talk my ear off about, whatever, video games or pet rights or whatever it is.
Right.
And so they have something inside them to say. They just then need the toolbox, so to speak, to get it on the page. And I think it also does vary a little bit, maybe between or just individually from one writer to the next. For some people, writing is kind of almost a spiritual, meditative practice, and they just kind of do it when they feel like it, and that's all they want out of it.
Yeah.
Some writers do it for a career, and like you said, I have to write this many words by the end of the week and turn it into these 3 editors because that's my job and that's what I do.
Yeah.
Some people are in between, it just kind of depends, but we would not have nearly as many books in the world if writers only wrote when they got a lightning bolt from a muse.
That's a good point. The future of Star Trek, it's one of near instant communication and limitless resources and multicultural exchange. So presumably, it's a golden age of education. And I was talking to Dr. Mohammed Noor, who's a professor at Duke University, about this. And we were talking about how if you don't have to pay teachers because everybody's taken care of, then you're not losing them to the corporate world, or you're not having them quit because they can't afford to keep doing it. Class sizes are presumably not an issue when you can ostensibly study anywhere. And since tuition is free, a student in the 24th century would really have to want to drop out. Presumably the system would have no cracks for them to fall through.
Presumably. I mean, that aspect of being able to have a teacher who can live without worrying about their paycheck changes the game, because unfortunately the state of the education profession in the country right now is pretty dismal as far as teacher compensation and work commitments, class size, stress levels, all that sort of stuff. And at this point, if you're in teaching, it's because you care about making a difference in kids' lives. Nobody does this for the money.
Yeah.
But if you could reach that sort of a situation where the money capitalistic element was removed entirely, I think it would revolutionize everybody's ability to learn better. And so as far as like kids choosing to engage with the system or not, there is always that element of a student has to want to learn. Like you can't force someone to learn, but you can expose them to information that they will potentially realize was important later on and be happy that they had. And you can also give them opportunity. And I think that's what Star Trek's utopian vision really excels at, is that they've leveled the playing field, removed whatever glass ceilings were there for different populations. I teach in a very small rural district, and a very high majority of our kids deal with poverty and poverty-related issues at home, and those just come into the classroom and affect those students' abilities to learn. And they still do. Like everybody does their best to meet them where they are and to help them. But if you've removed poverty and if you've removed money altogether from the system, then that disappears as a factor that could hold kids back from really realizing their full potential.
Yeah. I actually come from a family of teachers and educators, and I myself flirted with teaching. I think I was an elementary ed major for about a semester and a half in college. So I know that teachers are chronically overpaid and underworked. You didn't really have to want to be a teacher right now to be one. But in the 24th century, like you said, no poverty, no want, presumably free tuition, unlimited resources. I think that would really change, and presuming that people's lives and jobs are similar to ours but have more flexibility, it would really change the idea of continuing education from being something that an adult does to change a career or develop themselves more to something that anybody could do at any time. Like I get the impression from some of the scenes that we see of Starfleet Academy that people are in the Academy at different ages. Like Kirk joins the Academy we see in the Kelvin universe. I think he's like 25. Like he is past the point of being an undergrad by the time he joins the Academy.
Oh man, to not have, the debt of a degree following you like many people in my generation have, unfortunately, that would fundamentally change people's decisions of whether to seek additional schooling and to just learn more about things. I really think that education breaks down people's barriers and their maybe their stereotypes and their preconceived notions about the world. The more you're exposed to and the more people that you interact with, it becomes harder and harder to kind of hold on to those things. And that's a good thing for all of humanity. And so if tomorrow anybody could just decide, hey, I would love to study sociology, or I would love to study psychology or literature or whatever, and they could just walk into an institution of learning and do that.
Yeah.
What a better place we would live in.
Oh yeah, yeah, and it becomes an investment of time, but not necessarily money or finance. Yeah.
Right.
When I was talking to Dr. Noor, he compared education to a driving test. Like we want people to be able to drive. There's a social investment in people driving well. So we don't essentially bar someone from ever taking a driving test ever again if they fail it once or twice. They keep taking the test. So if it's in society's best interest to have an educated citizenry, why don't we treat education like a driving test?
Agreed. I think it was John Green that said something along the lines of, like, I don't have children, but I'm very happy to pay taxes into public education because I want an informed citizenry, and I want to live in a society where people have education and are able to be their best selves and to serve each other.
Which I think is at the heart of, again, it's like this amazing fiction, like everybody's going to want to help each other. That, to me, that's the most fictional part of Star Trek, not the warp drive, unfortunately.
Right.
But it is something that we can actually accomplish, I think, if we try hard enough. As you mentioned before, it's the weird sort of archaic nature of the structure of education as we see it in the 24th century is of interest, I think. I don't think that the writers thought it through very much. And there's a lot to like about our current system of preschool, elementary, and secondary education, undergrad, postgrad. But it's weird to think that it's apparently the only way to structure education. Like even in the 24th century, we hear Janeway talking about what she did in high school, or Harry Kim got a B on his book report in 6th grade. And humanity has contacted so many other cultures. Presumably, every classroom is super integrated with aliens. I can't believe that they're still using grades and they haven't found a better way to educate.
Agreed. And we see that a little bit in the episode When the Bow Breaks with the Aldeans.
Right.
And we have like little Harry who is, I don't know, he looks maybe like 8 or 9, and he's studying calculus, and he doesn't want to, and he's like griping about his calculus homework, just like, you know, kids today gripe about their math homework. And but then the Aldean culture, you know, is more focused on kind of art and music, and lets the children pursue their interests that they have.
Right.
And so I think the best sort of model is somewhere in between there. Like there are a lot of things that citizens of an informed society need to know that they might not want to study as young adults. And
yeah, I can
so,
see it.
for example, you know, reading the Constitution, or in my class, I teach an English class, but we do a project on human rights to learn research methods. And we start by reading the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the 1940s. And it's this founding document. It's not inaccessible. It's in, you know, it's something that the kids can read. Is it something they would choose to pick up and read? Maybe not. You know. So I think there are some things that maybe need to be in the curriculum that kids might not be like super jazzed about, but we also still have this sort of standardized model of everybody needs to pass the same test and even go at the same pace in a lot of cases, which really just is not ideal, and right now is only being continued because of lack of staffing and lack of resources to do anything different. You know, when you've got 37 kids in a room, you can't teach 37 different things at one time. But if you switch up that model, there's a lot of different possibilities kind of open up. But it is interesting that Starfleet's model seems to be very, very human. Like you said, I highly doubt that education has evolved in exactly the same way on all these other worlds.
Yeah, right.
So why are we still doing exams? You know, Wesley has to leave the Enterprise to go take his exams. Like, why can't there be like a cognitive scan, or why can't there be like a simulation, or I don't like. There's got to be other more efficient ways than exams, right?
I wonder if the bubbles have different grades. Like, okay, now you're done. Move to the 6th grade bubble.
Based on like Vulcan's kind of obsession with being right, or getting things right, it seems like there's got to be a grade or a score of some kind.
Yeah, and there's a Vulcan Academy as well. So yeah, it seems like there's a nod, or something of a nod, to the sci-fi idea of like knowledge tapes and like electric learning. In the original series, like Uhura gets her mind wiped by Nomad, but they give her some tapes and she's presumably re-educated, at least enough that she's back on the bridge by the next episode.
Yeah, and there's there's a lot of sci-fi that talks about being able to upload and download things from your brain, you know?
Yeah.
And I can see that being very realistic within, you know, however many decades here once we get that technology. So it's interesting. It's also very interesting to me in like a positive way that there are still paper books in the 24th century.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Presuming that we're not just slate learning in our data beds off camera, you know, we have to assume that the more traditional methods of teaching and the tools are there, and we don't ever get a sense of the tools that educators have access to. Everybody gets their own iPad, I'm sure, but we don't see how the technology is employed in education.
We do see that the Enterprise D has like a Fisher-Price version of the main computer that the kids can go on, in the nursery or the elementary school.
And they like hack it while they're
right. Yeah. They have to hack it for the episode. Yeah. I'd imagine that, as you mentioned, the holodeck would be indispensable as a tool in education.
Yes. I mean, we would be taking trips to all kinds of places. Like right now, field trips are so expensive,
Yeah.
So I wondered why was Keiko like teaching about the wormhole from inside the station? Like, why would you not take the kids on a runabout and go to the wormhole?
Right. Yeah.
Take them through the wormhole while you're teaching them, that kind of Miss Frizzle style,
Yeah. Right. Like Trip was excited when he got to go to Pensacola, but like these kids get to go into the wormhole. So yeah.
I would be excited about that. But I did like how DS9 tackled sort of the issue of what's appropriate content to teach in the hands of the prophets. When Kai it's Kai Wynn who comes in, and she's like, she's not Kai yet, but she comes in and makes a big deal about how Keiko is teaching the science of the wormhole. And I can see that would still be an issue in the 24th century, especially if you have a lot of different species and cultures mixing together in a classroom.
Oh, for sure. And you wrote an essay for Women at Warp about faith in the 24th century.
I did.
Which might be outside of the purview of this discussion, but it was something that, every PTA meeting, would it be completely fraught with like 27 different races who have religious objections to the curriculum?
Right. And I guess maybe DS9 was a special case because it was a Cardassian station next to Bajor that the Federation was running. And so I don't think anybody had a clear idea of whose job it was to actually dictate that curriculum.
Yeah.
Whereas in most institutions, you have a board of ed, you have a mission statement, you have, here's the guidelines for how we decide, here's the forum for discussion and stuff like that.
Yeah. And you have Keiko, who's just trying to be a community booster, and she sort of puts a school together, and suddenly people are yelling at her. Yeah. And they blow up her school.
They do. But I think she handled it pretty well. I think that's one of her stronger episodes.
Yeah. With holographic technology, distance learning might even be the norm in the 24th century. You could attend class as a hologram or have your professor appear in your home. Would any kid ever have to go to school? Are we all going to be University of Phoenix alums in the future?
So there's a lot of research right now in the education world on online learning versus in-person learning. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference between giving a kid a computer portal that has like online tutorials and modules that will self-grade themselves versus sitting them down with a content expert and who's responsive and they can ask questions to and who will build that relationship? And so far, most of the research says that content experts are irreplaceable as of right now. You can't replace putting a teacher in a room with students. Now, however you want to set up that room or how you structure those discussions is a different issue. But having kids have regular access to well-trained literacy experts, at least in the field of English, because that's what I'm familiar with, is the one thing that will has the most impact on their ability to learn. So that doesn't mean that the distance learning or the online learning formats can't work. And it's a little different if you're able to talk to your instructor via technology on a regular basis. Right now, I'm taking a graduate class through Michigan State University in advising journalism because I also teach yearbook. And it's technically, it's called an online class, but really the instructor is so open and accessible that it doesn't feel very much like an online class.
Okay,
and I really like that aspect.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, like citizens of the Federation have access to subspace communication, and presumably they have vast databases of information. We always see data, Googling something on the Enterprise, and having access to presumably every non-sensitive bit of available data in human history would be a total game changer for educators. No more textbooks. College bookstores would be a thing of the past, or they just sell varsity wear, I guess. And presumably, like the major colleges still exist in the future. We hear that I think Data is a lecturer at Cambridge, at least in that for future timeline. Do you think that distance learning and universal access to information would lead to a homogenization of the collegiate experience? Would you lose the character of a specific institution in higher learning?
I think there are so many traditions and personal legacies tied up in those experiences right now
Yeah.
that the landscape would have to change dramatically for people to let those go.
Okay.
So there, if you have gone to, even just here in my home state of Michigan, we have the University of Michigan and we have Michigan State. And the idea that those two could ever combine into the same thing, because there's this really harsh rivalry, right? And that is like unthinkable in this state. Now,
Yeah.
that's not to say that you couldn't come up with a system to do that, but people hold those things dear, and I think they enjoy them. Like
Yeah.
they like the sort of, I'm a state person, or I'm a Cambridge person,
Sure.
or whatever. Now, there might be potentially some elitism built into that. So if we're talking about a utopic system, I don't know how that jives, how does that dovetail?
That's interesting. I mean, you could attend Harvard from space, but only students that physically attended, Harvard would be getting into it with townies in Boston bars.
Right. And there's, there's that sort of kind of exclusionary principle that comes in with when we talk about who has access to education and who doesn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have a hard time believing that they would disappear entirely.
The physical access actually seems more magnified then, or the problem of it. I mean, if everybody can go to Harvard, if price and space aren't really a factor. I was talking with author Manu Sadia on the show about the idea of this elimination of scarcity in this future. And his theory was that like merit would be the last real currency in a post-scarcity world. Like the one realm of exclusivity left would be the meritocracy of achievement. Anybody can get a degree online from Harvard, but attending the school physically and rubbing elbows with other accomplished students and staff would be just for the people who had proved themselves through academic achievement.
And that seems to be very alive and well in the Star Trek universe, at least from Starfleet's perspective, because
Right.
we
Yeah,
see the cadets working so hard to achieve. They're not getting commission, like they're not getting money from Starfleet to
right.
be an admiral, but they still very much want to achieve that. Picard, is not happy being a junior grade officer or whatever his little dream sequence shows him.
Yeah.
So I would agree with that there's this idea of being able to achieve something.
Yeah.
There can be a danger in putting too much emphasis on trying to be better than others, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know where that line is, but it's the ability to provide like a needed service or something for society is never going to not matter.
Yeah, and the real irony is that except for just the larger question of scarcity in our society, we've kind of already hit like a very similar sort of level to what they have in Star Trek. I mean, we have a wealth of information readily accessible on the internet, and we've got teachers like at all levels. And I think that like with the structure, the way that the digital age has changed education and access to information, the teacher in the classroom has become less of the sage that educates you in all the things that they know, the gatekeepers of wisdom, and they're more like a facilitator of learning and providing context and guidance on the information that you're assimilating.
I think guide is a good word because the more information that's out there, the harder it is to wade through it. So that's why we spend so long on media literacy in my senior English class, because a lot of students don't know how to tell fact from fiction versus satire versus, anything else. And so, there's a lot of stuff out there, but being able to parse it, being able to analyze it and break it down and actually know what you're looking at and be able to interpret that effectively is still very much a skill that needs to be taught. It can't really, you can't just kind of dive in and hope that you can swim in that.
And you can get an Andorian text and run it through Google Translate, but do you have any context, or how does it, translate to English or whatever other language you're using?
Oh, that's great.
I think the really funny thing is, we talk about how the increase in communication has brought everybody closer together in our world and also in Starfleet. But for in the Federation, I should say, but for the families in Starfleet or on colonies or on space stations who are cut off from larger population centers, and they might have a panoply of races who have different customs or learning needs. It almost turns like every remote classroom, like Keiko's, into a one-room schoolhouse in space, which is a good pitch, I think.
Yeah, and I think some of that is just like ingenuity and people will figure it out. Like on Voyager, they weren't planning to be stuck out there that long.
Yeah,
And
right.
here's Naomi Wildman,
Right.
like wants to learn from everybody and, wants Seven to teach her. And so you have to figure it out wherever you are. I'm curious, the folks on Terralisium in Discovery, like would they just got like transported there? I'm curious
Right.
what they did for education. Like, was there a teacher in the room? If not, okay, like who's and,
Yeah.
and what do you teach? Like, because your society is gone.
There's a big faith-based element too. So I figure like everybody on Tyr Elysium is just like 6 generations of homeschooled kids.
Yeah, that might be true too.
Nothing against homeschool kids.
No, but it's a different sort of a dynamic.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're always going to need teachers and administrators to navigate the kind of challenges that we have talked about today.
Yeah, at the very least, the idea of teaching is really to be able to allow someone to open their mind to possibility
Yeah.
and give them opportunity to discover their own capacity to think and to interact with the world. And that is always going to be a thing as long as the human race exists. We
Yeah.
will need people who are trained in that. And I feel very lucky and to have this career because I get to work with kids every day, and I know that no matter what else happens throughout the day, no matter how crappy it is, like it's making a difference in some lives. And so I think that's worth it.
And you're not getting replaced by a bubble anytime soon.
I don't think so. I think that was a long way off.
The bubble can ask you how you feel, but it's really weird and it kind of brings everything to a halt.
The bubble can come assist me if it wants
Yeah,
to.
okay, sure. It's 10 minutes in the bubble for you. Well, thanks so much for talking with me today. This is a subject that I feel has been tangentially touched on this show, but I'm glad we were able to tackle it head on. So I appreciate you coming on. Let people know where they can find you online.
Sure. You can find me at my website, which is kellifitzpatrick.com, and that's Kelly with an I. And I am frequently at the Farpoint and Shore Leave conventions in Baltimore.
That's great. And do you know when we can expect to see your work with Star Trek Adventures be released?
I don't know the release date yet,
Okay.
but Modiphius has been just prolific in the amount of content that they're putting out.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I am excited to see this in print.
I know you have to be somewhat secretive about it.
Yes, unfortunately, I can't say
Yes.
anything about it yet.
I understand.
But I'm excited. It's going to be awesome.
Well, good luck with that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the conversation and for having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you.